It was the year 1598, and the streets of Madrid pulsed with the late summer heat, a dry, metallic warmth that clung to the sandstone facades and stirred the dust between the sandals of passing courtiers. Vendors hawked almonds and figs under canvas canopies, while distant bells rang with the stubborn clarity of an empire that still imagined itself unshaken. Priests passed silently through alleys, children ran with wooden hoops, and news from the New World arrived slower than rumours. Yet behind the high, sun-bleached walls of the royal monastery palace of El Escorial, Spain's most powerful man lay unmoving except for the occasional wince. Philip II, King of Spain, Portugal, Naples, Sicily, and titular ruler of a global dominion on which the sun famously never set, was dying, in his bed, not in battle, not felled by a coup or poisoned chalice, but by something far less dignified, his own lower leg. It had begun innocuously enough as a pain in the knee, but the pain spread, deepened, blackened. His leg swelled to grotesque proportions, the skin tight and glistening. Physicians were summoned naturally, an assembly of learned men, with impressive beards and limited understanding of infection. They poked whispered, recommended leeches. And so, the king, whose orders had once determined the fate of continents, now submitted to small biting worms in a porcelain basin. For a while, there was hope. The king had survived worse rebellions, naval disasters, excommunication. Surely he could survive this unsightly inflammation. He even continued reading dispatches, writing notes, receiving confessions. But the leg grew worse, developing what one court chronicler called a humour of such foulness that even the candles recoiled. When the skin ruptured and pus leaked through embroidered sheets, the court began to understand they were not witnessing an illness but a transformation. Philip had always feared chaos. His reign was defined by an obsession with order paperwork, filed meticulously. Prayers said hourly decisions passed upward, toward God, and downward, through councils. But the body, as it turned out, had its own sovereign laws. It did not wait for approval, and so it rotted slowly, imperiously, from the foot upward. He refused to leave El Escorial, the grim granite complex he had built north of Madrid. A palace, a monastery, a tomb, a library, all symmetrical, all regulated. Philip had personally approved the angles of its corridors, the height of its crucifixes, the cooling shade of its cloisters. There, beneath vaults and saints, he would meet his end. Outside, courtiers maintained appearances. Inside, linen soaked in sweet oils was tucked into crevices of the mattress to absorb the seepage. Servants changed the bandages thrice daily, though one was reported to have fainted from the smell. The king did not complain. He gripped his crucifix, murmured Latin phrases, and waited for the swelling to move higher. In many ways, this was his final victory to endure, with regal restraint, the very undoing of his body. He had spent his life orchestrating divine authority. Now he staged his own disintegration with nearly theatrical solemnity. But the curtain was slow to fall. It would be 53 days before he died. In that time, the wound festered. His beard grew wild. His nails curled inward. His eyelids fluttered, then remained open for hours. He could not sit, could not walk, could not sleep without whimpering. One morning, as a fly buzzed unnoticed above his head, a priest noted that the king no longer responded to names, only to the sign of the cross. The leg had darkened to black. His spine arched involuntarily, and yet the ceremonial schedule continued. Incense was burned, bells were rung, royal hours were observed. It was on paper a death fit for a monarch. In the flesh it was something far closer to a medieval warning. Philip had designed El Escorial not as a palace of pleasures, but as a monument to divine symmetry, a monastery fit for kings, a royal residence fit for monks. It stood cold and vast upon Castile's plain, more tomb than home, even in its prime. He had overseen every detail the grey granite hauled from the nearby Guadarrama mountains, the stark cruciform layout, the absence of frivolous ornament. Here the mortal and eternal would cohabit in order, silence and stone. And so when the king's body began its slow collapse, it did so in the very chambers he had once walked with the pride of a man confident in the plans of God and in the correctness of his own. The irony did not go unnoticed, though it was never spoken aloud. The man who had built a house of discipline now lay captive to his own flesh, suppurating in silence beneath coffered ceilings of his own commission. His private chamber became a theatre of contradictory smells, wax frankincense and human decay. Behind heavy curtains, sunlight was kept at bay, so as not to aggravate the sores on his legs and buttocks. His mattress, specially designed to be firm and godly, proved merciless on a frame now thinned by fever. Under the carved saints that watched from the chamber's walls, physicians hovered like flies. They whispered, debated, measured the swelling of his limbs with calipers. Some prescribed ointments made of mercury, others goat's milk tinctures. All failed. Still the royal routine persisted. At dawn the king was to be shaved, his linens changed, his bandages examined. This, however, now took hours. The act of lifting him was itself an ordeal, requiring 4 men, a system of pulleys, and a prayer before the bandages were even touched. Sometimes his skin came off with the cloth. Yet he neither screamed nor wept. He clung to his crucifix and muttered psalms, his voice rasping through cracked lips. For Philip, suffering was not only expected, but theologically appropriate. In a world where divine favour and bodily misery were often interpreted as parallel tracks, his decay could almost be read as confirmation of sainthood. At least this is what the priests suggested. Each ulcer, each festering wound was likened to the passion of Christ. But the comparison faltered as the king's bowels failed him. Holiness, it seemed, could not compete with the reek of rot. Servants washed the sheets multiple times a day. They burned herbs in the fireplace, changed the rushes on the floor, hung fresh rosemary on the window sills. Still, the smell escaped. Ambassadors sent to inquire after the king's condition were met not by words, but by wafts. Courtiers began feigning illness to avoid proximity. One German envoy reportedly described the air as more pungent than any field of battle. His suffering, however, was meticulous. He refused opiates, asking instead for readings from St. Augustine. He insisted on receiving his ministers upright, though the process of seating him was closer to taxidermy than hospitality. At one audience, he fainted mid-sentence, his eyes rolling back only to regain consciousness moments later and apologize for the delay in state matters. Such were the rituals of a man who had once commanded the largest empire in the world, reduced now to orchestrating the dignity of his own ruin. Each day Philip asked for updates from Portugal, the Low Countries, and the Americas. Maps were spread across his bedside table. He tapped them with yellowing fingers, giving instructions to men who no longer listened. His son, the future Philip III, stood silently nearby, his face a blank page. The king tried to dictate a letter to the Viceroy of Naples. Midway through his tongue swelled and would no longer form words. He stared, panicked, at the ink-stained page, as if it too were decaying beneath his grasp. Outside, El Escorial's cloisters remained serene. Monks continued their processions. The sun still set behind its towers in symmetrical glory. But inside, the symmetry had ruptured. The king's body, which had once symbolized imperial unity, now resisted all order. No amount of architecture could contain its breakdown. And yet, no one dared call it what it was, a man dying slowly and with exquisite horror in the very temple he had built to defy death. The body was losing its war with itself. By the 3rd week of August, the royal leg had become a map of lesions purple-black, crusted, some oozing slowly, others bursting without notice. The physicians no longer argued treatment, they argued timing. When precisely would it be best to ease the king into confession, into preparation, into the long agonizing wait for the soul to separate from its host? But Philip, still lucid between fevers, remained obstinately devoted to the matter of governance. His flesh had betrayed him, but he would not surrender the crown to biology. At court, the tone shifted from reassurance to logistics. Bandages were measured by the yard. Attendants were rotated like soldiers in a siege. The process of simply removing the king's slippers took nearly an hour, as the skin on his feet threatened to detach entirely. Yet the rituals continued not out of hope, but inertia. Every day the royal almoner entered the chamber with prayers. Every day the royal notary stood at attention with a fresh scroll, hoping to capture the king's final testament. And every day the king lived. Religion offered comfort, but also complication. Philip's intense Catholic devotion demanded purity, even as his body contradicted the very notion. The priests surrounding him now had to navigate the paradox of a holy king, whose flesh could no longer be touched without gloves. Cleansing rites were delayed until his sores could be covered. On one memorable afternoon, a bishop performing the last rites gagged mid-anointing, a moment quickly, smoothed over by a flurry of incense and the abrupt singing of hymns. There was too the problem of visibility. Philip's reign had always cultivated a certain distance between ruler and ruled a divine silence, projected from balconies, portraits, and gold-leafed decrees. But illness has a way of collapsing distance. It made the body vulgar, porous, and embarrassingly present. And the king, once the most remote man in Europe, now needed 2 servants simply to sit upright in bed. One was tasked with holding his head. The other ensured the blankets did not fuse with his wounds. Beneath all this, the mechanisms of empire ground on. Reports arrived from the Armada's survivors in Flanders, where a new storm had scattered the fleet. Jesuits from Mexico sent relics for the king's comfort. A shipment of Peruvian silver, late by 7 weeks, finally reached Seville. Philip attempted to review each dispatch, though his vision had grown cloudy, and at times he addressed letters to men long dead. His ministers, trained in the theatre of obedience, nodded and bowed, then quietly rewrote the orders once outside the room. By early September, his fingers had begun to twist with gout. Even the act of holding a crucifix required assistance. He attempted to dictate a message of farewell to the Duke of Lerma, but spoke only fragments, Latin phrases, childhood memories, phrases from Mass. A note-taker captured what he could later describe as a kind of final psalm, composed in confusion. The worst indignity, though, was the boils. They bloomed across his back, beneath the scapula, he refused to remove. Some were so deep they bled into the bedding. Servants would find coins embedded in the sheets alms he had attempted to give in his sleep, pressing them against invisible poor. One morning a housefly became lodged in an open sore. It was removed with tweezers and the bandage resealed. Despite all this, appearances were maintained. Visitors were admitted only after rigorous scenting with cloves and vinegar. The chamberlain announced each guest even when the king's eyes no longer focused. Bishops bowed, ambassadors left trembling not from reverence but from the shock of having glimpsed Europe's most powerful man in a state no artist could ever paint. The contradiction was total. Here was the defender of the faith, the most Catholic king sovereign of 2 worlds, reduced to sores and fluids, a withered spectre clinging to God as his body disassembled itself. No enemy had done this. No sword, no heretic, no French intrigue. It was his own blood, his own tissues that conquered him. Outside the royal chamber, the rhythm of empire faltered. Ministers conferred in whispers, scribes sharpened quills over blank parchment, and guards shifted uneasily in polished boots, unsure whether they were protecting a man or a memory. Word of the king's condition had reached the corners of his realm, from Lisbon to Lima, from Milan to Manila. But no one, not even his closest advisers, could quite agree on what that condition was. He was not yet dead. But neither was he truly alive. Inside, the scene was increasingly theatrical in its grotesquerie. Courtiers tiptoed around the odour, masking their expressions with lace handkerchiefs. Despite the thick tapestries and perfume burners, the stench lingered, a sickly fusion of rot sweat and sacramental oil. It clung to collars and stuck in the throat. Even seasoned physicians began attending with shorter visits and longer silences. Yet protocol demanded presence. Every visitor had to genuflect, kiss the royal ring carefully wiped before each audience, and speak as if the king still ruled with vigour. One French envoy later wrote that the king nodded once with the solemnity of a statue, though his lips had grown too dry for words. It was unclear whether Philip understood the visit, or whether he had in some way already left. Still, he received communion daily. He had requested a special altar be placed within sight of his bed, so that Mass might continue uninterrupted. A friar celebrated each service with hushed urgency, his eyes darting toward the king's face, as if trying to gauge whether the monarch's soul still lingered behind his swollen lids. On good days, Philip managed a nod. On bad ones, his mouth gaped open dry and unmoving, a silent gargoyle of royal piety. The room, despite its silence, was never empty. Pages came and went with fresh linens. Nobles took turns standing vigil, their faces growing paler as the hours passed. At one point, a young courtier fainted upon glimpsing the king's exposed chest, a flesh that had turned a hue somewhere between ivory and ash, spotted with lesions resembling burns. No reprimand was issued. Instead, the boy was quietly reassigned to the archives, and still the empire watched. Outside the Escorial's granite walls, life trudged on. A rebellion flared in Aragon. Pirates attacked a convoy near Cartagena. The Queen of England, that unyielding Protestant thorn in Philip's side, continued to send gold to his enemies in the Netherlands. Yet, in Madrid, all these events were processed through the slow, muffled filter of impending death. Decisions were delayed, edicts postponed. The very machinery of state seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for the inevitable to finally uncoil. The king's son, Philip III, now loitered uncomfortably in the outer rooms. He had not been trained to rule, only to obey, and in this long twilight of his father's demise, obedience offered little guidance. He watched as ministers deferred to a man too weak to blink. He watched as prayers were offered over a body that twitched but did not rise. And he watched as the empire, like its king, began to smell faintly of something past its prime. One evening, a physician removed a poultice and exposed bone. The silence in the chamber was total. No one spoke of it, not then. But from that point on, the visits became briefer and the expressions more fixed. The dying had accelerated. His skin split open at the joints. His teeth loosened. His urine turned black. A small crucifix was tied to his hand with silk, as he no longer had the strength to hold it. By now, the king spoke only in murmurs, mostly Latin, often unintelligible. He repeated the same phrase, fiat voluntas tua, again and again, as if bargaining with a god who had already decided. On September the 13th, at just after 5 in the morning, his breathing faltered. The priest reached for the chrism. The chamberlain prepared the final record. But Philip lingered for hours, each breath more shallow than the last. A wax figure melting in real time. At sunset, the bells tolled. not for victory nor for peace, but for a body that had finally admitted defeat. The court upon hearing the bells did not weep, not immediately. That would come later, after the ceremonial mourning had been announced, the black garments issued, and the official proclamations composed in flawless Latin. In that first hour, there was only stillness, the kind of stillness that arrives when something vast, immovable, and terrifying has finally collapsed under its own weight. The body, or what remained of it, was left untouched for the better part of the evening, not out of neglect, but reverence, or perhaps apprehension. For weeks those closest to the king had witnessed his flesh unravel. Now that the soul had gone, the question of what to do with the remnants became one of logistics rather than legacy. The task fell to the embalmers. They arrived discreetly, bearing candles, spices, and tools of quiet violation. The chamber was cleared of nobles. Only monks and physicians remained mumbling scripture as the process began. The body was undressed slowly, each layer of linen peeled away like bark from a rotted tree. What they found beneath was more supposition than human. The legs were gangrenous and collapsed inward at the joints. The stomach had bloated, as if still resisting burial, and the smell, despite open windows and perfumed cloths, clung to the rafters like an accusation. Embalming in the late 16th century was less science than sacrament. The goal was not to preserve life, but to preserve dignity, or at least the appearance of it. The organs were removed by candlelight, placed in sealed urns and wrapped in fine cloth. The body cavity was filled with aromatic paste and sewn shut. The face, waxen and drawn, was covered in powder and pressed with a cloth, dampened in rose water. It helped, but only slightly. The following day, the public mourning began. Heralds proclaimed the king's passing throughout the city. Priests intoned dirges in every parish. Black banners were unfurled along the Escorial's corridors. In Madrid, shops closed for 3 days. In Naples and Lisbon, masses were held on royal command. In the Americas, where news would take months to arrive, the king was still alive, even as his remains were being prepared for eternal sleep beneath the crypt of the Panteón de los Reyes. It took 12 men to carry the coffin. It was not light. The casket, layered with lead and cedar, was lined with velvet and bound in silver trim. Courtiers followed in silence, many of them finally weeping, now that the eyes of protocol were upon them. At the threshold of the basilica, incense thickened the air. A bishop led the procession in prayer. The coffin was lowered slowly, not into the ground, but into history. Yet for all the splendour of the rites, a certain disquiet remained. Those who had been close to the king in his final weeks could not quite erase what they had seen. They had watched as power decayed, not in politics, but in flesh. They had heard the bubbling of infection under royal skin, smelled the failure of the human form beneath vestments of state. No oration, no liturgy could quite obscure that. There was talk afterward of sainthood. Some claimed to have seen light above the king's brow at the hour of his death. Others insisted his patience in suffering was proof of divine favour. Hagiographers quietly drafted their versions, omitting the boils, the smells, the way his lips had blackened at the end. They painted instead a serene monarch crossing into eternity with a smile. No mention was made of the pus or the linen burned in secret. And perhaps that is power's last privilege, to curate even the grotesque into grandeur. The same king, who once had portraits retouched to soften his jawline, now became in death a creature of virtue and martyrdom. But among those who cleaned the sheets, who held his head, who fetched the vinegar and pinched their noses and turned their eyes away, there lingered another version. One, not of majesty, but of something far more human and far less comfortable. El Escorial resumed its rhythm as all institutions do. Monks returned to their cloisters, the bureaucrats to their ledgers, and the granite corridors so carefully proportioned by Philip himself, no longer echoed with the scraping of sickbed feet. The monarch was dead, but the palace he built to defy time endured stern cold and unmoved by the scent that had once haunted its upper chambers. Philip III ascended the throne with dutiful solemnity. He bore the same pale Habsburg face, though without the eyes of a man who had ever ruled anything beyond his own wardrobe. His father's death had taught him one lesson: above all kingship was not glory, but burden, measured not in victories, but in the management of slow declines. He ordered more prayers, he spoke little, he left the real decisions to others. Meanwhile, the body of Philip II rested beneath marble, entombed in the royal crypt beneath the basilica, alongside the remains of his father, Charles V. The chamber was a Baroque masterpiece of polished black marble and gold, a place designed to impress eternity itself. Here lay the bones of empire tucked in caskets, each bearing the same name. But the worms, it must be said, did not read Latin. Over time, the decay of the king became metaphor, then memory, then myth. Painters avoided his final years, preferring the stern, ascetic monarch of earlier decades, upright, armour-clad, unblemished. Biographers softened the details, preferring to speak of a lengthy illness, rather than describing the ulcers or the moments when servants had to lift his eyelids with moistened cloths just to clean beneath them. In the collective imagination of Spain, Philip II came to represent steadfast rule, unyielding faith, and the burdens of universal monarchy. But underneath the incense and pageantry, another truth simmered, one far less poetic and far more telling. For all his vast dominions, for all the coins that bore his face, and all the altars that invoked his name, Philip II died the way all flesh eventually does not, with the thunder of empire, but with the slow leaking retreat of the body from itself. Perhaps the most unsettling contradiction was not that he suffered, but that he suffered with such discipline. He was a man taught to believe that pain had meaning, that the body was a vessel of divine will, that affliction was refinement. And yet, in his final weeks, no divine pattern revealed itself. The sores came anyway, the breath shortened anyway. The faith remained intact, but unrewarded. One might be tempted to see this as tragic. But in Philip's world, it was something else entirely expected, even ideal. He had not conquered his body, but he had endured it. He had not escaped decay, but he had contained it within ritual. And in doing so, he became not less royal, but more, not despite his suffering, but because of it. The empire would fracture in the decades that followed. Spain would bleed in the Netherlands, limp through bankruptcies, lose its hold on maritime supremacy. But the image of the monarch who had ruled from paper-strewn desks, from dim candlelit chapels, from a sickbed soaked in vinegar and prayer that remained. Not glorious, but immovable. And so his legacy was not triumph, but stillness. Not the blaze of conquest, but the smoulder of control, control over territories, over ritual, over pain, and when the time came, over the very spectacle of his decomposition. What remains today is not just the tomb or the titles, but the echo of that contradiction, that a man could command half the world, yet be defeated, inch by his own foot. That the most Catholic king could be reduced to suppuration. That El Escorial monument to divine order once reeked of something utterly profane. And that somewhere beneath layers of velvet wax and stone, a royal corpse drained, perfumed and powdered still lies in formal silence, daring history to forget the smell.